it's, I think, highly significant that we are doing our work here in the heart of Asia, the world's most dynamic region. We hear all the time now about the so-called rise of the East, and it's something of particular interest to me, and I think should be of interest to all of us here at this time. Not only are we talking about the growth, the quantitative growth of higher education and of education more generally, but also the growth in quality of many of Asia's leading institutions of higher education from a growing range of countries. In the past, what we saw was more of what we could say was one-way traffic. That is, of students from Asia generally travelling to the major countries of the metropole in the OECD for purposes of study. But in fact, the patterns were always more complicated. As we see there, students from Meiji Japan, for example, were sent abroad in the middle of the 19th century. Students from Qing dynasty China were also sent abroad for purposes of study, including to Japan. In the period after World War II, during the period of what was known as the Cold War, what we saw was student patterns of mobility split into two. So students from the socialist world tended to study in the major countries of the Eastern Europe, largely in the USSR. On the other hand, students from the capitalist world tended to study in those major topics. The dominance of English language was another feature of patterns of mobility, and I know we're going to hear a little more about some of that as our conference proceeds. What that meant, though, was that Asia was largely seen as a source of students rather than a destination. That, as I'm going to argue this morning, is changing substantially. It's still the case that Asia is one of the major sources of international students. As you see there, something like 2.3 million students from Asia are studying abroad somewhere. But the big change is that Asia is also now attracting more and more students, some from within the region and some from wider abroad. So it is now attracting something like 1 million students. But there are patterns there that are also important. Notably, the one I've selected there, the influence of patriarchy, particularly in East Asia, but in some respects more generally. That affects both student data, scholarship patterns, and so on. But if we go back even further, what we find is that in what we could call the classical era, patterns of mobility are in fact quite prominent. So even in ancient civilizations, mobility was a feature. Confucianism is an obvious example. Spreading, particularly during the Tang dynasty, to areas in current Southeast Asia, particularly countries like Vietnam, but also to Korea and so on, and very influential for something like 1,000 years or so. The major religious traditions, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, and Hinduism. This includes here in Sri Lanka, with the history of monastic education. In particular cases, I hope I'm getting the pronunciation right, Mahavira and Vijayabha Piravina. These were large monastic institutions that in fact attracted students from the region to come and study here. It attracted students from China, from Afghanistan, and Pakistan, for example. It's important to remind ourselves that Confucian learning, Confucius himself, was born around about the same time as Plato. We tend to think of Plato in the West, but it's important to remind ourselves of this other major source of higher learning. Based on a very specific curriculum that was formalised during the Sung dynasty, and spreading, as I said, to Vietnam, Korea, and so on. It's also another element of mobility was the fact that Buddhism was brought to China by monks, in particular this one, Xuanzang, in the 7th century, who travelled to India, studied for many years at the famous Nalanda, a university that has now just been re-established after 1,000 years. And he returned to China, firstly to Xi'an, in those days called Chang'an, with something like 600 boxes of manuscripts, famous Buddhist manuscripts that he had spent years studying, and spent the rest of his life translating many of them. So bringing Buddhism to China from India was another important pattern. And as I've said, there are famous institutions in India, like Nalanda, for example, a famous Buddhist scholarly centre that enrolled several thousand students, including from, as you see, several neighbouring regions. So, when we talk about the rise of the East, I think in many ways it's better described as the Renaissance of the East, because it is really a rebirth and something that takes into account those ancient origins from this part of the world. That included, of course, major Islamic centres of learning, Al-Azhar in particular, which of course was founded well before the universities of Oxford or Paris that we now take to be some of the oldest universities. It still attracts many Islamic students from particularly Southeast Asia, but the pattern is now beginning to change. Another element that's been of significance has been colonialism, of course. A profound and enduring influence with both some positive and some negative consequences, depending on who's telling the story. What we see is particular patterns. So some of the English-speaking Commonwealth countries, for example, have long reflected a British influence. India, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Singapore, Burma, now generally called Myanmar, reflect more of a British influence. Indochina, the countries of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, for example, more influenced by the French. Spain influenced the Philippines at one point, and Russia and subsequently the USSR influenced the early development of post-revolutionary higher education in China, at least up to about 1956 when they split, and also Vietnam. But the important point here is to see it as a two-way dialectical process. We see the local influencing the global just as much as the other way around. At times, these local traditions strongly reshaped and resisted Western models. And the quote there is from Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India at the turn of the 20th century, who said in a famous quote, "The East is a university in which the scholar never takes his degree." It is a long process to understand. So one pattern was that a small number of local scholars were educated, but their further intellectual development was always tied to the metropole. So, for example, a famous example, Ho Chi Minh, the great Vietnamese revolutionary leader, in order to further his study, had to go to Paris. And of course, the assumption was that he would become imbued with French culture and philosophy and so on, and that would fit the French colonial aspirations. In fact, of course, he joined the French Communist Party and became a extreme nationalist, so it didn't really fulfill the French ambitions at all, but it was very important for Vietnam. Gandhi in England reflects something of the same tensions. So the goals of colonialists were by no means always parallel by the aspirations of local intellectuals. So what we have is something of a contradictory growth of a legacy of growth and modernity. One of the ways that's expressed is this synthesis of East and West that many systems are trying to grapple with in our part of the world. The Chinese have an expression for it, and you'll excuse my, I know we have someone from Taiwan here, you'll excuse my pronunciation. Zhong Shui Wei Ti, Xi Shui Wei Yung, which means Chinese ethical knowledge combined with Western practical knowledge. And many systems are striving to achieve that kind of synthesis, and it's not something that's easily achieved. But we see more and more systems in our part of the world attempting to build so-called world-class universities. Every system wants one, at least one, possibly several. In practice, it's a little unclear as to quite what that means. But you can see examples there. Japan's top global 30 program, Malaysia's Apex university system, and University of Malaya's high impact research program, all of which are designed to boost their universities and the global rankings race. Vietnam, a much poorer country,